Janice didn't come. sent another email saying they have another funeral at 11:30, but he's able to schedule.
Oh, 11:30, leaving 10:45. Yeah, yeah,
No, you
yeah.
leave it at 10:45.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. There he is. Okay. Good morning, everyone, both here and there. And I want to welcome you to the second semester of the 22-23 MID year. As you know, we will have Rabbi Alexander starting today, and she should start about 11 o'clock because Rabbi Mark will have to leave a little early for a funeral. And we're delighted to keep going. And Rabbi Mark continuing with his Wandering Jews, and Rabbi Alexander with Jews of California. So we look forward to that, and relax, enjoy some snacks, and if you're at home, enjoy some snacks. And remember, please, to use the mic, because you have good things to say. Thank you. Good morning.
Good, I missed your map class.
You missed my map making?
So which country is this? Shanghai, there you go.
Yeah, but Hong Kong and
You've been to Hong Kong.
across the border, China. That was
That must be the Silk Road. Is it? Well, I got one thing right. The Silk Road.
oh, absolutely. We have a lot of smart people in this class. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so, yes, I do need to leave about 5 minutes early. I've got a funeral, but I can get there if I leave at 10:45. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so, yes, today we are going to talk about the Jews of China. And, say again? We were going to do Chile, but I decided to do China today as in sort of like a big. We'll do Chile next week, and we'll finish up the C's next week. Okay, so the Jewish presence in China goes way, way, way back, probably to what's called the Song Dynasty, S-O-N-G. And that's about 960 to 1279. So we could say 1000 CE. To give you a perspective, the first Crusades happened in Europe in 1100, so right around in that time period. And there were reports of Jewish merchants at that time, and they were called Radhanites, R-A-D H-A-N-I-T-E-S. Or
So where did that word come from?
Good. So that's my next point. The origin of the name is not certain. There is a city in what in ancient times was known as Mesopotamia, whose name very similar to Radan, but it could also, some scholars have suggested that it came from a French city as well, because these were Jewish merchants who originated in Spain and France. And so we're not sure of the origin of the name precisely. However, it was reported that they came via the Silk Road through Central Asia and India, and they ended up in China. And they were in many cities transporting merchandise and bringing scientific and technological expertise, either by land or by sea, from Spain and France, via the Middle East to China. There are also reports, at least by one author at the time, who said that they also trafficked in young boys and female slaves from Europe. That's hard, but it could very well be true. Remember, very important, remember that slavery is not looked at as illegal or a problem in the Bible. Slavery was a very common thing. And there were slave owners in the south of the United States, Jewish slave owners in the south of the United States during the Civil War, etc. So slavery was not an issue really for Jews. Only in modern times has it become that way. So there was a medieval Italian Jewish explorer. His name was Jacob of Ancona. And he reached China in 1271. So we have verification that there was at least one Jew, for sure, coming into China in 1271. But there, the presence had already been recorded in Kaifeng before that. Marco Polo reported on the importance of the Jewish traders at the same time, around the 13th century, the 1200s. And Genghis Khan, whose life was 1162 to 1227, right around the same time, he issued directives that Jewish populations were not allowed to observe kashrut, and they were not allowed to circumcise. They had to follow Mongol traditions and food. So, so in terms of some of the oral traditions, meaning these are things that are not written down, but have been told from family to family to family, etc. And as you well know, our tradition is made up hugely of an oral tradition, things that are passed down. So one thing, for instance, do you know if you are a Kohen, a Levi, or a Yisrael? Well, the only way you know that is because someone in your family has been passing that down for generations and telling you, oh yeah, we're Levis, we're Kohens, we're not, right? Okay. So according to the oral traditions, the first Jews came through Persia after Titus captures Jerusalem in 70 CE. So remember, when the Romans come in and destroy the second temple in 70 CE, that's General Titus who does that. And there is a arch called Titus's Arch, which shows the Jews being taken from Jerusalem, with the friezes show giant menorahs, and so the temple was ransacked, all the gold. And incidentally, I mean that's why successive, what's the word? Yeah, civilizations, but I can't think of the right word. Ascendant civilizations at the time would always go after temples, because temples had a lot of wealth. and every empire needed to have more wealth. Why? Because empires always expanded. And so in order to expand, you need lots of money to expand and then to carry on operations within your expanded empire. The problem for all the great empires was there is a point at which you expand too far. And then you can't keep control of the outside territories. And at the same time, often what happens is a challenge from within the center. So they implode from the center because of challenges to the ruling parties in the center, and they disintegrate from the outside because they can't keep hold on the outside territories. And this is going to be important in a few minutes because in our discussion here. That's what happened with the Roman. It happened with every single great empire of the ancient world. They expanded beyond where they could expand. They started falling apart from the outside, and then challenges to the monarchies on the inside, and then that weakened the empire such that the next ascendant empire could come in and conquer them. It's sick. It just happened with every single one. So Titus captures Jerusalem in 70 CE. He takes the Jews, many, many Jews, prisoner, brings them to Rome. And we don't know, but some may have been forced to build the Colosseum. There are some conjectures, no proof whatsoever, but some conjectures that a lot of the gold that was taken from the temple was used to fund the building of the Colosseum or used in the building in various places. No corroboration anywhere, just a conjecture. There were oral traditions that the Jews of Kaifeng, which is probably the most important older first city where Jews settled, were comprised mainly from the 10 lost tribes. No corroboration whatsoever, just an oral tradition passed on through families. Now, there have been 3 steles, S-T-E-L-E-S, which are monuments. And these are monuments which were found in Kaifeng. And there was one dating from 1489 that commemorates the construction of the synagogue there in 1163. And it talks about the transmission of the religion of that synagogue from Abraham to Ezra. That particular synagogue was subject to many fires and floods. And that's going to be important in a second because one of the stelas talks about rebuilding it. In 1512, we have the second stela that's discovered, and it details the religious practices of the Jews of Kaifeng. In the 16th century, which is the 1500s that we're talking about, we see many of the Jews of Kaifeng, many, some, enough that it's important, convert to Islam. Interesting. We don't see that in a lot of places. In China. Jews converting to Islam. And in fact, the first leaders of the synagogues there were called mullahs. In 1663, we have the third stele, which commemorates the rebuilding of the first synagogue. So we have archaeological evidence, obviously, that attests to Jewish presence in Kaifeng earlier. And they're sort of commonly referred to as Kaifeng's Jews. That's a good question. I couldn't find any information on that whatsoever. I looked all over for it. The question was, why did the Jews of Kaifeng, or some of them anyway, convert to Islam? What was the pressure? I can only imagine, the Jewish population in Kaifeng was small, obviously, compared to the larger population as a whole. And when we're talking about the 16th century and the 1500s, so Islam becomes ascendant in 600 and marches through the world and takes over a lot. And over the course of time, the idea of convert or die had many communities converting. We know many Jews resisted that, they moved it, whatever. So it is conceivable that in various parts of China that had a larger Muslim population, that there was great pressure there. But I'll continue to try to look at that and see.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if it had anything to do with the Ottoman Empire, which was in power at that time in the Middle East, and if the Jews were traitors, and they would have to go through the Middle East, and maybe that is a reason.
Good.
And it could be a rationale.
Good. So Rosa's point about having to do with the Ottoman Empire is a very good point, and it's actually going to become much more significant in sort of modern times, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Yes, Janice. Sure.
Thank you. So we were in Philadelphia in the Jewish Museum downtown there, and there were these things on the wall, and the docents couldn't translate it, but my husband could read Hebrew, and it was things that the ministers who had been at Kaifeng had written down from what they heard. So there was no R in it because there's no R in the sign in the Chinese language, but it was Hebrew, and it was Hebrew prayers that they had heard in Kaifeng. So there were clearly Jews there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, thank you. Thank you. And during the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, so slightly previous to what we've been talking about, all the way up to what we've been talking about, the emperor assigned names to Jewish families, surnames to Jewish families. And there were 7 of them. And the 7 surnames for Jewish families were Ai, Shi, Gao, Jin, Zhang, and Zhao. So, yeah, these were 7 Chinese surnames given to Jewish families. And what's kind of interesting, so the surname Shi corresponds in English to Stone, like John Stone or Emily Stone, and the surname Jin translates to gold, James Gold, Abraham Gold, whatever. So these are all Chinese names that would indicate some kind of Jewish lineage far in the past. In the 16th and 17th century, there were notations in manuscripts that there were at least 10 to 12 Jewish families in Kaifeng who could trace their lineage back over 600 years. Over 600 years. And so the manuscripts at the time state that there were more Jews in Hangzhou than Kaifeng. I didn't put Hangzhou down here. Hangzhou is like right here. Yes, right across from Shanghai. And does anybody know where Beijing is?
North by by that curve.
I would put it north of Kaifeng.
By the curve. Yeah.
Right there?
It's a little south of that, curve.
Yes, right around here. Obviously, my map skills are not tremendous, but yes, more or less right there. And there were more Jews who had migrated to Hangzhou than from Kaifeng. And why was that? Because there was an incident in Kaifeng called the Jingkang incident, Jingkang. And what it had to do with, it was a war between two ruling families who were competing for the dynasty, the Jin and the Song. And the Jin won. And the Jin Kaifeng was one of the major cities of the Song dynasty that had just been defeated. There were many royal palaces there. And so the Jin came in and ransacked the imperial palaces of the Song in Kaifeng. And so obviously there was a great deal of civil unrest. There was war. Jews took off and they went down to a city that was a little bit safer in Hangzhou. During the 16th century, there were Jewish Chinese men who worked in the government. They owned large pieces of property. So it wasn't that Jews were discriminated against at all. Some Jews rose to very high positions. There were many more communities that were established during the Middle Ages, all throughout China. The Jews were called Yute Ren. Yute Ren. And the scholarly opinion is that that has to do sort of a derivation of Yehudei, or Yehudai, or Yehuda, so Jews. And they were also historically called Tiao Jin Jiao. And that means the religion which removes the sinew. So, that should... why are we the religion that removes the sinew, meaning the sciatic nerve? Kosher slaughtering, because of what? What is our proof text? There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Very good. So, very good. So you'll recall that in our Torah narrative, Jacob wrestles with something. We don't know what it is, but he wrestles with something. And during the struggle, he is hurt in the hip joint. And from that, the laws of kashrut concerning the sciatic nerve are derived, and so we don't eat the sciatic nerve. So that's what we were called, the religion which removes the sinew. That's kind of weird, huh? Interesting. Janice says it's actually very descriptive. It shows exactly what it is. Yes, yes. But I think it's very interesting that what I meant by that's weird is as a people, we are defined by one particular law of kashrut, rather than what we believe about God, what we believe about the world, what our general practices are. We are sort of brought down to, okay, the people that take out the sciatic nerve, those are the Jews. So Janice says, I think you can also look at other religions that have a single descriptive. Do you have one in mind that you're thinking of? So Janice says, think about Christianity. Their single descriptive is whatever happened to Jesus. Yes, you could make that argument that the most notable feature of Christianity is sort of a one-sentence idea about their theology, why Jesus was sent to earth, died for the sins of humanity, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a large theological statement about a group of people, and it talks about their belief. This particular statement talks about one tiny little area of Jewish law. That was my only point. But you're right. One single thing that describes the religion. Okay, I'll go with you on that. Okay. In Shanghai, we have the first wave of Jewish immigrants in the 19th century, so the 1800s. And they are Mizrahi Jews from Iraq. And they are engaged mostly in the opium trade and cotton yarn. And they were from Baghdad. They were called Baghdadi Jews. And back to Rosa's point here, why did they flee Iraq? Because at the time, Iraq was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, along with many other places. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman control of Iraq was beginning to erode. And as the Ottoman influence and control eroded, there left a vacuum. Within the vacuum started persecution against Iraqi Jews, so Iraqi Jews fled. And many of them went to Shanghai. In more modern times, Jewish merchants from around the world began to trade at Chinese ports. And so the ports of Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Harbin, which we saw up earlier, became very important. And you can imagine in the 20th century, Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe and Russia, which we've talked about in basically every country. And I think that's going to be a sort of common denominator for everything in the 20th century. Jews went wherever they could go. Yes? Good. So a lot of Jews went to Shanghai. Can anyone take a guess why? Say again? Almost. You're on the right idea. They were given visas that they could go. The idea of visa is right, but they weren't given visas. They didn't need visas. Shanghai did not require a visa to go. No, I'm talking about Jews of the Holocaust. Yes, absolutely. So many of them went to Shanghai because it was one of the only places they could go. A visa was not required to get into Shanghai. Yeah.
And yeah, Jews went to China, also went to Japan because Japanese didn't know that Jews were any kind of a problem. There didn't make any difference to them. Japanese in Japan, there was no problem for Jewish people until the Germans came to Japan and said, "What are you doing? These people are bad. You've got to get rid of them."
Thank you, Janice.
I think there was a documentary about an ambassador in Lithuania from Japan who helped a lot of the Jews leave.
Yes?
And I think who's that? Sugihara. So, I don't know. I thought he took him to Shanghai.
One at a time.
We have some of our members went through Shanghai, escaping from Poland and Russia, and the Greens, for example, two brothers that went from Poland all the way across to Shanghai, and then from there to the United States.
Very nice.
Yeah, I have another question. What kind of intermarriage took place because the Jewish men, I mean, who had gone to Kaifeng, did they marry native women? I mean, I'm just curious.
Yeah, they did.
Okay, so
They did.
I know.
Yeah. Yep. Shall we say the level of observance was very light, very light. Yeah, Shanghai became a very important place. Incidentally, I have a picture of me in the Shanghai airport with Zach when he was 18 months. I've got his hand, and we're walking through the Shanghai airport. It was really cute. Yes, I'll repeat the question. I have a friend who came to Shanghai from Germany during World War II. And she was saying the most memorable thing is that they were kept up at night by the Chinese men who were playing mahjong and all the tiles were clicking. That's a good story. Sure. So you went to China, but you didn't have a chance to see the Jewish areas. Okay. Very nice. So this wave of Holocaust Jews, it had started out earlier as Mizrahi Jews, and then obviously became entirely Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe, fleeing pogroms and fleeing Nazism. Now, Russian Jews came in large numbers as well to northeast China in Harbin, up at the top there. After 1917, which is the Russian Revolution, mostly white Russian Jews. White Russian Jews not meaning Caucasian Russian Jews. White Russians. In the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, where Nicholas and Alexandra were deposed and then executed, you had two factions. You had the Bolsheviks, who were the Red Army, which is, for instance, now why communism, you have it's a red sign, yes? And then you had the White Army. The White Army was supportive of the Tsar. The Red Army was supportive of overthrowing the Tsar. The Red Army won. So the White Army had to flee. So there were Jews who were serving in the White Army as White Russians, that's what they were called, and they fled to Harbin in northeast China. And at the time, there were approximately 20,000 Jews in Harbin, and they were involved in politics, the economy, international trade. This is going to become really important when I tell you in 2019 how many Jews there are in Harbin. Okay, but the Japanese occupation of northeastern China starting in 1931. So in that part of the world, we have what were called the Sino-Japanese Wars between China and Japan. There's always been a great, I don't want to say animosity, but there's been a lot of tension between Japan and China. We know that China is like 100 times the size of Japan, right? Or more than 100. But the Japanese army was very, very, very strong. And it took over many parts of China. China at that time was not nearly as developed. Yes, Gary says at that time China was very weak. There was a lot of corruption and lack of political leadership, which made it very weak and subject to takeover, which the Japanese did. And so when the Japanese occupied northern China, Harbin, many Jews fled. And they went south to Tianjin, Shanghai, and also some went to Palestine. And remember, in 1931, think about this for a sec, 1931, this is pre-Israel, obviously. Who is controlling Palestine? The British. Palestine is under the British mandate. So the Jews fled to British Palestine at that time. And there are reports that the Nazi representatives planned to eliminate Shanghai's Jews. And this goes to Janice's point just a little bit ago. The Japanese occupation of China was 1937 to 1945, during the Second Sino-Japanese War in particular. And what ended up happening, obviously, the Japanese and the Germans were part of the Axis coalition against the Allies. And so, obviously, they were in communication a lot. And so Janice's point to that there was communication between the two, absolutely correct. What ended up happening, the Nazi plan to eliminate Shanghai's Jews, Shanghai being controlled by Japan at that point, ultimately was nixed by the Japanese authorities because they didn't want to create more problems than they already had. So they said, you know, I think this is a fight we don't need to get involved in. We got plenty of other fights to deal with. We're not going there. In 1979, we have the establishment of Kehilat Beijing. And when I pulled it up on the computer, Kehilat Beijing, it looks like, it doesn't say, but it looks like kind of an egalitarian, pluralistic, more towards progressive congregation, led by lay leaders. It doesn't say it affiliates with any movement. So remember that anything that's going on in China right now is obviously controlled very strongly through the government. And as a communist country, religion is very much suppressed, downplayed, and basically, kind of do it, but we don't want to know anything about it, and we don't want you telling us anything about it. In 1992, the Institute for Jewish Studies at Nanjing University in the city of Nanjing is created. In 2010, that last census placed about 2,000 to 3,000 Jews in Shanghai. So not a tiny community, but certainly not very large. There are synagogues now in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Chabad is in Beijing, starting in 2001. Good for them. And as I alluded to earlier, in 2019, Harbin, which had at one time 20,000 Jews, guess how many Jews they had? 20. Keep going lower. 0. Keep going higher. 1. 1 Jew. 1 Jew in Harbin. Oh, tell me about that. I just read an article about the last Jewish man in Kaifeng.
I can't tell you any more than that, and I'm not even sure which magazine I read it in, but it was about the last Jewish man in Kaifeng.
That's a little odd to me because starting in 2015, the Jewish population of Kaifeng began to increase. So maybe. But the latest information I have is that the community in Kaifeng is actually doing pretty well. They're not allowed to have public displays or festivals. So Passover is out, Sukkot is out, and obviously this is because of the communist government and the downplay of religion everywhere. But my understanding is that there is, in fact, a community there, but I think what we would call the level of observance to traditional Judaism is very, very, very much on the lighter side. Because there are certain things that they can't do. I mean, having to find kosher food is not easy. Mikvahs, all kinds of things. So, by and large, any of these Chinese communities will be on the less observant side. But thank God they're there, and thank God they're still going, right? So that's what I have for you about the Jews of China. I think yes. Oh, and what did this? So Gary says recently they were in South Africa and they went to the museum there and they had a very big exhibit on the Jews of Shanghai. Do you remember anything from the exhibit? Very interesting because the history of the Jews in Shanghai goes way, way, way back. Yeah, yeah. Yep. It doesn't reach. I'm repeating it.
It doesn't reach.
So in their last visit to China, they had an Israeli guide who was married to a Russian lady take them through Jewish Shanghai. Was it wonderful? It was very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, last question. There is a community of Jews in Hong Kong. There is a synagogue in Hong Kong, but Hong Kong has only become sort of important in much more recent history. I didn't mention it because there were no older significant events going on in Hong Kong. The only thing is that there is a Jewish presence in Hong Kong. There's a synagogue there, and there's a small community there. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful
Thank you,
week.
Rabbi.
You're welcome.
We were notified that there's going to be a fire alarm set at 10:45. So, Rabbi, you're leaving at the right time. So we have to go out to the parking lot. So grab your bags, purse, whatever. And it shouldn't last more than about 5 minutes or so. we were delayed. Well, whatever
You can have snacks.
whatever you want to do.
Hello. Am I supposed to turn this on, Rosalie?
Oh my God, I thought we weren't using that.
I don't know.
No, I thought you said we weren't.
I'm not using it tonight. I'm not using PowerPoint today. Yeah.
We don't need it.
Okay.
So, I don't think we've ever officially been
Hi.
introduced. I'm Verna Levitan.
Hi, Verna.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
You
you.
left the year we joined. So,
It's so nice to meet
and
you.
nice to meet you too. I think my husband's been taking your Saturday morning.
Saturday morning, yes, he
Yeah.
has.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
so now you know who goes with.
Tell him that we're doing this Saturday morning.
I will.
Because we missed last week because of the Shabbaton for the synagogue. Oh, I love this seating setup. Then I can see everybody really well. Hi, Helen. Well, you've got your hands full. It's nice to meet you. What's your last name? Okay. D-R-E-Y-E-R? D-R-A-Y-E-R? Okay. Nice to meet you, Helen. Oh, how lovely. Little refreshments. I mean, how much better could it be? Hi, Ernie. How are you doing? This time around, only the garage got a little flooded because the drain had leaves on it. So it's better than the house. I'm,
My son, I told him about your, and you know, he's in real
yeah.
estate.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
No, the company he works for is a real estate development, rather big in size. They bought all of Universal, and he said, buyer beware.
Mm-hmm.
He said, no matter what they say, beware.
Yeah, we didn't do it in a really great way. We saw the house and we went, oh, yes. And we'll move and we'll be back with our kids and
Which is both
I'll
right.
get to come to Adada Riel and then we had a lot of problems with our house when
Yeah.
You didn't get an inspection?
we got 6 inspections. It didn't.
Well,
Didn't
you
help.
got 6 inspections,
Yes.
then you did it right.
Well, anyway, it's fine now.
Good.
Good morning, everybody. I don't know what time it is. What time is it?
It's almost 11.
Okay, so we're going to wait just a few minutes in case somebody wants to chew or swallow a little bit more of your wonderful snacks. And then I'll introduce myself and what we're doing here today and for the weeks to come. So, everybody ready to do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can ask you a question, though.
Sure.
You'll have to ask Patrick how to put you on here whenever you need it. It's a big screen.
Yes, is this going to be, but we can't zoom in here, can we? I don't know, maybe we can.
We can zoom in.
Well, we have a couple of weeks to worry about that, so we're good. So good morning, everybody. I was asked, first what I'd like to do is I'd like to do the blessing for learning. Did you already do that with Rabbi Goodman? All right, my habit and tradition is always to begin with the blessing for learning, because whether we're studying Jewish texts or Jewish historical texts or Jewish comedy or whatever it could possibly be, we're still learning Torah, and it's a wonderful thing for us to be together to do that. So the blessing, I'll just review, is a regular blessing, but the last 3 words are la'asok b'divrei Torah. And the way that I always remember that is that it means basically to immerse yourself in the words of Torah. And I think to myself, aha, the word soak means to immerse yourself. So la'asok b'divrei Torah. So if you join together with me, if you are so inclined, if you're not a blessing sayer, no problem. but that's just my tradition. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, all of you in Cyberland, whoever is there. I want to talk about a couple of things as we begin, then I understand you've been learning about Jews in China a little bit, and we'll take a minute on that, and then we'll hop into what we're going to be doing over this semester. So one of the things that I've discussed is that I like to use pictures and different kinds of things on PowerPoint. And I like them to be on a big screen so that different people in the class can read different things and share, so it's not just always me talking to you, but that we interact with one another. And so what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and make it possible for all of you out there in cyberspace to come in via Zoom within a few weeks when we'll be using the PowerPoint, which means that if we can do that, we'll be able to see who's at home, which means that, from my perspective, it means we'll be more of a class altogether. And in addition to that, many different people can participate in offering the different kinds of texts and things that we're going to do. So I don't think it's going to change anything for those of you who are sitting here, but it probably will change something, hopefully for the better, for the people who are not able to be here in person. So that's that for that. We're working on it. We'll see if that goes that way. And if not, I'll be handing out a lot of pieces of paper to you throughout the course of the semester. Either way, it's going to be fine. I am very excited to be here. For those of you I've just met today, and for those of you I've seen before, I'm very excited to be back at Adat Ariel and serving at Adat Ariel for hopefully a little while longer. And for those of you who don't know me, I was here when I was almost out of rabbinical school, which I have not been here for 26 years, but I served Adat Ariel for 10 years. So when I first got here, it was 36 years ago. And then we moved to Northern California for my husband, who works in the Silicon Valley, and we just moved back a year and a half ago to be near our daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter who live in the Pico Robertson area. So yay, it's very exciting for me. I love every minute of being back here, and I'm so grateful for that. But I am turning 68 years old, so that's a lot of years from when I was 30 and got here for the first time. So we're all here together, and MID was always one of my favorite things. So now, into what we're going to be doing together. Anybody have any questions, comments? Is my daughter religious? My daughter is a conservative Jew, and she belongs to Beth Am in the city, and my granddaughter Romy goes to preschool at Pressman Academy. So I'm happy about that. I also have a daughter, Eliza, who lives in New York City, and she was 2.5 when we left here, and she is 28. So, we won't call her the most religious person on the face of the earth, but she's a proud Jew, so I'm happy about that. Any other questions? Okay, so when I was a very young adult, before I even became a rabbi, I got very, very interested in the history of Jews in California. At the time, there was a museum slash a place for research called Brandeis and Judah Magnus Museum, both of them, and they were in Berkeley. And I went to do research there. And the more research I did, the more excited I became about the history of Jews in our state. So what we're going to do over the next number of weeks is we're going to explore that. Let me tell you how. First of all, it's a little bit more, it won't be frontal education, meaning I'm not going to be speaking at you for all of these weeks, but the first couple of weeks are informing you about some historical things in the development of Jewish life in California. After that, we are going to spend a few weeks in Gold Rush country, at least symbolically, where we'll be sharing articles from newspapers, letters that people wrote, all sorts of things that actually came from the people who went up into those small towns to find the mother lode and to make their fortune. We'll also, for several weeks, be talking about later on about the San Francisco earthquake and what happened to Jewish life in Northern California and California as a whole when that happened. We're also going to spend several weeks exploring the people who built Jewish California. And there are many of them, and their backgrounds are really interesting. And of course, you know, we're going to talk about Levi Strauss, but we're also going to be talking about a number of other people who were involved in making this the great place Jewishly that all of us live. So then we'll talk a little bit, since this is Multi-Interest Day that was offered by Women of Adat, we're also going to be taking a look at some of the women who really made a difference in the establishment of the Jewish community in the state. And the reason that that's important is, well, when you think about the gold rush, for example, you don't think about a whole bunch of women in pretty long dresses with parasols coming along with them. So people who really did make a difference are very, very important. So today, we'll be completely in Northern California, because we're going to talk a little bit about how the San Francisco Jewish community came to be, because that happened in advance of any major Jewish settlement in Southern California. So we're going to start with that. Oh, I forgot. If we have time at the end of the class, we're going to also go into the early days of motion pictures in California, with some of the people, introducing some of the people whose names we've heard, but to learn a little bit about the history of the development of that and how it affected the Jewish community in the early 20th century. So that's the plan. Are you okay with all of that? Okay, good. So today, please bear with me as I kind of tell you the history, but I do have something to distribute to you a little bit later when we're talking about the synagogues that were built in the middle 1800s in San Francisco. And I brought some pictures of one, so it's not just hearing facts that we will spread around. Joette. Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. Thank you for reminding me. I was in California mode. You learned a little bit about the Jews in China today. So I said when we were out in the parking lot that at Adat Ariel we're hoping to do an evening about Jewish life in China during the time of the Holocaust. But my parents met and married in China. They fled from Austria, my mother by way of Kinderstransport to England, my father from Berlin, and they both ended up in Shanghai, which he probably told you was the only open port for Jews in the world. So I don't know what Rabbi Goodman said, but I am a product of the fact that Jews were able to run to Shanghai. And my parents' home was filled with furniture that they brought back from China, some of which, thank God, I still have. And I actually have the film of my parents' wedding in Shanghai. So over the course of taking a look at, is he teaching about Jews in Shanghai as a?
No, he's doing Jews from different countries of the world. Today happened to be China.
I see.
So that,
Okay.
it was a one-off.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Good. Excellent. So I'll be sharing that with you in some of the months, not in this class, but we'll be doing this at Adat Ariel. So stay tuned for it. I'm not going to do maps, but I'm going to do stories and realities of Jewish life there. I don't exactly know. We're planning the calendar for the coming year, beginning with Rosh Hashanah, and I hope it will be soon after Rosh Hashanah, but it probably won't be in the next couple of months. You'll have to wait. If I tell this class all of those things today, I'm not doing that program. So, yeah, it has to wait. I'm sorry. But we have to get started with California, and we'll see. I'll talk to Rabbi Schulden-Frey about how soon he wants to do this program. They were very fortunate people, my parents, and really wonderful people, as Joette well knows. So, yeah. So, okay. So, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I promise to tell you everything when we do that. Yes.
Do you know Jonathan Friedman?
No.
Okay, he's head of the cantoral program at the Jewish Academy.
Mm-hmm.
He previously taught here in MIT.
And did he teach this already?
He's very well versed in California Jewish history, and he taught a couple of classes on Hi Neighbors on Zoom.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope I don't repeat all the things he did. Yes, Susie. Oh, Gary said that there was a cantor, Jonathan Friedman, who has taught a couple of classes for High Neighbors on Jews in California. Well, we have like 12 weeks to do, so let's see if we can get some other information than what you've already heard. We shall see. But thank you for being here, even though you've already heard some of these things. Okay, we'll be doing that too, so you'll probably hear about that, but it won't be today. Are we ready? Yes. Okay. So the saying goes that Jews did not come to San Francisco, they built San Francisco. And that is really true. And we're going to learn a little bit about that today. Without people who came in the Jewish community, numerous things would have never happened in the city of San Francisco. So why did the Jews come to California, beginning in San Francisco? The French Revolution had raised Jewish hopes of equality, and for a while, under Napoleon, before he went completely nuts, he freed Jews and made Jews be able to participate in things in the community that people had never allowed before. They were allowed to attend general schools starting in 1804. The men were accepted into the militia, which means they got to fight for their country, which Jews had never been allowed to do before because they weren't considered citizens enough to do so. That was 1805. There used to be a poll tax against Jews, which was abolished in that time at 1808. and they were granted citizenship in 1813. But they still had a lot of restrictions. Only the eldest son in a family was allowed to marry. And then in 1819, a whole bunch of anti-Jewish riots broke out. They were called the Hep Hep riots, in case you studied world history. And because of those adverse conditions and all of the things that were going on, the families of a large number of young Bavarian Jewish men urged that they immigrate to the US. So then a second wave of Jews came to the US after the 1848 revolution, which had tons of Jewish riots. So because all of their dreams in their own homeland were crushed, they came to America. Approximately 200,000 Jews emigrated from Germany during the mid-1800s. Obviously, not all of them came to what would become San Francisco. The same things attracted Jews to the West as any other people, but it wasn't their first migration when they came to California. Most had to come first to the East Coast to escape poverty and persecution in their countries of origin. And when they heard that the gold mines were discovered in the West, they uprooted again from New York or wherever they were, and they came to California. We began coming to this area in numbers between 1840 and 1850. People came from the East Coast, from the Midwest, from Savannah, from New Orleans, from Charleston, where a lot of Jews were brought by ship, and also from Central America, and believe it or not, even Hawaii. They have documentation of all of that. It seems clear that there were a number of Jews who were already in California territory when it was still Mexico before 1850, because there are numerous Jewish names in the historical chronicles and the city directory from 1850 already includes Jews, a significant number of names and ads for Jewish-owned businesses. Now, I'm not bringing it today. I didn't bring it today because we're not yet in the 1870s, but I have a directory from 1875 from San Francisco. So whatever the precursor is to a phone book, I have that. And we'll be able to see as we pass it around or look at it, names of people that are really famous, including Levi Strauss and his business that existed in San Francisco during that time. So one of the things, I told you this is very frontal today, I'm telling you the history, but I hope that throughout the weeks to come after we're done with this history, we'll be much more hands-on, because for me that's important. So, we were found in the West as early as 1836 with pioneers in mining, mercantile trades, vineyards, banking, chicken raising, and more. The kosher chicken raising, as you may know, I don't know if anybody knows about this, but it went on in Petaluma until the 1970s, and it was socialist and communist Jews from Eastern Europe who came over to Petaluma, established a community, and what they went into was chicken farming. So even when Northern California was a very small Jewish community, it was really easy to get kosher chicken. So that they fought amongst themselves because they had some people who they called the Rechter, they were on the more right politically, and some people were called Linker, who were on the left, and they had a community and they cared deeply about each other, but they were always at each other's throats, which is sometimes a Jewish custom. So there we go. So we were also on the dockets of the first mail steamer that came in San Francisco in February of 1849. So can you imagine the gold fever gripping everybody? And we were no different. We were all determined to amass fortunes and build permanent homes on the Pacific coast. So initially, all of these Jews who came concentrated on mining, but they soon learned that the soil and climate and need for manufacturing and commerce pointed the way to many different kinds of fortunes to be made. So guess what we did? Everything. So we probably, if you think about it for 2 seconds, you'll probably say shmatas, right? Clothing, because we've had a history of a lot of clothing manufacturing in California. But first, when California became a great grain and hay center and mineral and agricultural bounties could be sold across the globes as harbors come about, they became involved in hay and grain, and when that became less lucrative, fruits and nuts became the crops in demand. And I just lived in Los Gatos in Northern California, right next to San Jose, for 26 years. And believe it or not, a lot of the crops that were really central to San Jose, dried apricots, dried prunes, those kinds of things, a lot of Jews involved very early on in those agricultural endeavors. The reason that I'm stressing this is that if you talk about Jewish communities and you ask people who don't know and you say, did Jews do farming? We generally say, huh? That's not what we do. But that is what we did. So all of those places that were fruits and became dried fruits and fresh fruits that were grown in the Silicon Valley are now exactly that, the Silicon Valley. And Apple and Google and all of that built their businesses right on those fields. So one of the things that was really great is they had to import a lot of things from the East Coast. Now let's talk about Jews in the early days of Jewish life in Europe. One of the things that was really, really good for Jewish community, think about the Rothschilds, okay? Try to think about like the most famous rich Jewish family. How did, what? Banking. It was banking, but initially it was something else that was really important. But banking too, they were involved in all sorts of sales of merchandise that was needed. But what made them so successful is the same thing that was terrible about Jewish life. We all in our families got scattered. But in this particular instance, scattered. We, things would be upheaval in communities, and people would have to move places. So one part of a family would go one place in Poland, and the other part of the family would go to Bavaria, and the other, they went all over the place. But what happened, and what happened with the Rothschilds, yes, in banking as well, was being in different communities with your cousins one place, and your uncle another place, and your brothers another place, made it really easy for Jews in Northern California, beginning in this their whole quest for success, was they didn't have to go to somebody they didn't know on the East Coast to get goods shipped in. They could write their cousin. And most people couldn't do that because they had no upheaval. All the people in the family lived in the same place. Any questions or comments here?
So you're saying that the Rothschilds were in different cities.
Mm-hmm.
Did they communicate in Hebrew?
Depends on the family. Did the Rothschilds, I guess, and other people communicate in Hebrew or in other languages? So, one second. So let me answer that question. Sorry, I have to get used to this speaker system. Some of the families communicated writing their letters in Hebrew. Some of them wrote in their European language, shared language. Some of them were written in Yiddish. So there are documents of all different kinds. And it also depended on what kind of information they were trying to transmit. If they wanted to transmit information they didn't want anybody else to read, they would write it in Hebrew or in Yiddish.
Well, the Rothschild had several different branches, English, French, and European. They were all over the place.
Right.
And my mother, when she wrote letters to her, she wrote in Yiddish to those that
Right. So Yiddish was, Yiddish and Hebrew were used in those kinds of situations. But the Rothschilds didn't come to California. I was just trying to give you an example of what made commerce so much easier for Jewish settlers. Aggressive business types in the Jewish community would buy up the merchandise that came before it even hit the docks. They would rent a schooner, a little schooner. They would take it out into the ocean, go to the ships, and by the time they hit the coastline, they had already literally gotten the goods. By the later 19th century, many businesses were established or led by Jews which became closely identified with San Francisco. And some of those you might know. Businesses like what used to be the Anglo-America Bank, businesses, department stores like the City of Paris, which also used to be in Los Angeles but was developed in San Francisco. How about this for your toilet paper? Crown Zellerbach, who does all the paper towels and things that you can still find their little boxes in bathrooms. Fireman's Fund Insurance. If you've ever been to San Francisco, Gump's, which was a very famous store, or H. Liebes, or Magnon's. Joseph, right. Yes, and yes. So we're going to learn about that in terms of the people involved. MJB Coffee, which when I was a teenager and I went to work at a factory in San Francisco during the summer, you would drive over the Bay Bridge and smell the MJB coffee. Anybody ever been to the store Ruth Atkins back in the day for men's clothing? That was all over. So, okay, Sutro and Company, we'll learn about Sutro. Wells Fargo Bank, established in San Francisco by the Hellman family. They also were very active in Los Angeles. And there was another store, the White House. So San Francisco Jews were clearly upwardly mobile. Sephardic Jews first settled in the United States in the East Coast. They became leaders in journalism and law and government. Bavarian Jews achieved economic, civic, and cultural eminence. Poles and Prussian Jews saw California as their breakthrough to Western civilization because they had come from Eastern Europe, and they were not as polished as the other Jews were. They were hardworking, generous men. And as we proceed during this course, we will read some actual articles that were written, both ones that have elements of anti-Semitism to them and ones that have elements of support by outside communities of the Jewish community. San Francisco was really, really, really egalitarian, and the Jewish elite were inseparable from that of the total community. I just want to say about that affected what happened in the San Francisco Bay Area and differently than what happened in Los Angeles, which we will see as we proceed. In San Francisco, Jews, as I said, they didn't come to San Francisco, they built San Francisco. So what happened was, since everything was so egalitarian, there wasn't really a need for Jews to necessarily live in their own neighborhoods most of the time, unless they were coming and just getting established. People were very integrated in the society. But that is good and bad. Because if you are immediately integrated into the wider society from the perspective of Jewish life, you don't end up with a Fairfax. You don't end up with a Pico Robertson. You don't end up with a community where people can go to expect that they'll run into other Jews. So that was something they really had to work at. Are you all okay? I'm really trying to be as animated as I can teaching history, so I hope it's all right. So we instantly integrated ourselves into the rapidly developing communities there, and notably in San Francisco. A citizen's standing in the city was based primarily on performance rather than background. And so we became part of the meritocracy. I will tell you at some point later on when that changed a little bit, but now we're talking about the 1850s, and that's absolutely the way it was. Jews were freely accepted, and there was little anti-Semitism. And the way that you can measure all of that is because when we are talking about another ethnic community just getting settled in San Francisco, which was the Chinese community, they had it much, 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 much worse. And actually, at a certain point in this class, we'll be talking a little bit about how people in the Jewish community helped people in the Chinese community. By 1853, so we are talking about a gold rush that started, do you know when? 49, thank you. By 1853, there were 3,000 Jews, and we started out with a much smaller number, a handful, living in the area. But the pioneering Jews also saw the need to organize charitable and religious organizations. They had to seek out a kindred community. So Jewish mining congregations and benevolent societies, including cemetery societies, were found almost immediately in places like Sonora, Stockton, Nevada City, Fiddletown, Grass Valley. Jewish cemeteries from the period are still cared for by historical associations today in many of these areas. When I was a teenager in USY, what time are we, we're okay, right? When I was a teenager in USY, one of the things we did as a mitzvah project was go up to those gold rush areas to clean the Jewish cemeteries. They are still there and marked, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the class. However, there actually were tombstones there that said, Joe Cohen died with his boots on, you know, like that kind of thing. So when we get to Gold Rush Country, we're going to be discussing Gold Rush Country and sharing texts together. We'll be learning a little bit more about that period. I'm also going to be bringing books and pamphlets for you to see that offer information about all of these kinds of things. And if you ever want to go on a road trip, going on a road trip up to Gold Rush Country is fun anyway, but there's a lot of Jewish things to be able to see. Those cemeteries are all in existence and maintained. There's actually an organization, if you ever decide you want to send an $18 contribution, there's actually an organization for the maintenance of Jewish cemeteries up in the Gold Rush Country. So yes, absolutely. And that's something that's very interesting too, because it's much easier to see when you go up there that the Jewish cemeteries are maintained than some of the others. So any other questions before we move on? The early Jewish presence in Gold Rush San Francisco is acknowledged. on a bronze plaque on Montgomery Street. Montgomery Street is now the banking center of San Francisco, and banking in San Francisco is a global, it's a massive global center of banking. That in the 1800s, that was the shoreline of the bay, but they did fill in, so it's no longer the shoreline of the bay. It commemorates the first celebration of Rosh Hashanah in San Francisco near that site in a wood frame tent. Actually, the first such observance on the West Coast on September 26, 1849, which corresponds to 5610. So let me share something with you. In a letter to his brother in Philadelphia, a person named Morris Samuel said, about 40 or 50 Israelites have engaged a room to celebrate the ensuing fast day and have invited me to attend. We contemplate building a synagogue shortly. His letter was so excited because these guys were there alone. They wanted them. They didn't really get them very soon, but they were there all by themselves. They were the representatives of the families that I mentioned earlier that said, get the heck out of here and go. And they ended up going, seeking their fortune near where the gold rush was happening. But they were by themselves. So the 30 or so Jews at Rosh Hashanah, 50 on Yom Kippur that first year, were of diverse Jewish backgrounds, including Joseph Shannon, an American-born Jew who would become the first treasurer of the county of San Francisco. Benjamin Davidson, an Englishman and a Rothschild agent. Barnett Keesing, whose wife was the only woman to attend, and Louis Franklin of Poland, in whose store the community first worshiped together. I think that's a beautiful thing. All of these people, all by themselves, in a place that was accepting of them, thank God, just got together for Jewish purposes, and it was so exciting for them. There's a story that demonstrates the strongly embedded spirit in a Jewish pioneer to observe Yom Kippur Day. One of the participants, his name was Joel Noah, is said to have made a mistake in celebrating the date of the 10th of Tishrei being observed the preceding day. He was all by himself observing Yom Kippur, fasting. He got on the road, and when he was done, he thought he was done fasting, and he was going to go by himself to find some food to eat to break the fast, all by himself. And then he met up with several other Jews heading to Yom Kippur services in their rented room because he got the day wrong, all by himself. So when he was convinced that these people were really members of the Jewish community and that he had gotten the day wrong, he went with them to services and spent an entire additional day in prayer and an uninterrupted 2-day fast. So it's wonderful to have this story that lets us know how tremendously important it was to these people to connect with people who, they weren't really landsmen, as they would say, because they didn't come from the same places necessarily, but fellow Jews. And one of the other extremely lovely things about it is, this was something written in a text that I could use to tell you about, which means that there are things that are still, lots of things that are still available to us to read about what was going on with these people. I don't know what time it is, so you'll have to tell me. What time is it? Oh, okay, we got a few minutes then, right? Okay. So there was no Torah scroll yet. A printed Pentateuch that one of the guys had was used, But the service was tremendously important as it made the new San Franciscans realize that they had to start developing an actual Jewish community with all the needed infrastructure. As a result of this, Emanuel Hart, a magnanimous person, presented the group with a burial plot. That was important. We'll discuss that in a minute. But in the Talmud, actually the Mishnah, we have that there are certain things that need to be built right away when Jews come to a community. The first one is not a burial plot. Do you know what it is? It's a mikveh. Thank you, everybody. So it's a mikveh, but there were no women. Or only one or two. So they started with the burial plot because when you go somewhere new and you're working in things that you're not used to, you can contract different kinds of viruses and diseases, and they were concerned about that. So he gave them the money for the burial plot. They also decided to meet more regularly for private services, and Joel Noah, the guy of the 2-day fast, became in charge of that. The idea of creating a permanent synagogue community and seeking to build homes for them continued. Shereth Israel was founded in 1850. It was created to be a traditional, comfortable for the English, North Germans, and Poles, but not for the rest of the Germans. So they soon seceded and created Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco in 1851. These groups didn't really socialize with each other, and their customs and traditions were very different. The schism, because of geographic origin and culture, was also demonstrated by the formation of 2 separate charitable organizations, the Eureka Benevolent Society for the Germans and the Hebrew Benevolent Society for the Poles and others. You know that joke about the shul you won't attend? Right. They did that. They did that at the beginning. They both, though, furnished schools, orphanages, cemeteries, a Chevra Kadisha, a burial society, and they did cooperate in purchasing a larger Jewish burial ground in the Western Addition and called it Presidio Cemetery. Soon, Shereth Israel bought property on Stockton Street in 1852 in San Francisco with plans to build a structure of wood or brick, and that they wrote how big they wanted it to be. It was dedicated in 1854. Temple Emmanuel, whose first president was Emanuel Berg, one of the guys who was there at the very beginning, leased a room in a new building owned by a Jewish community member. The women of the community, because a few more came on board, including Mrs. Keesing, who attended the first high holiday services, made the place look attractive. So we're going to, probably not today, well, let me go on just a little bit, because I have some pictures of Shereth Israel built in 1850s, and I definitely want to share them with you, but let me go on just a little bit, and maybe I'll do it next time. So they began to collect money and raised a ton of it to build a permanent synagogue. But they had a series of fires that were setbacks for some of the members, and the building was delayed. Now, when we get to 1906, and we're dealing with the earthquake, we know that it wasn't really the earthquake that caused the worst of the things that happened. And we're not doing earthquake for a while, because we're only in 1850, and that's 1906. It was the fires. Fires were a big deal. Things burned down. Shereth Israel burned down once. So what happened was when these people had their businesses burned to the ground, they, like everybody else, you know, I lost my job. I can't contribute to this year's fund. And San Francisco at the time, and I'm going to close with this today, was a rather wild place when Jews first got there. Imagine Gunsmoke, but which was in Dakota or whatever. But, you know, dirt streets, wood planked sidewalks and all they had on those streets were saloons, gambling halls, all of those kinds of things. And up in the mining places, even worse. And churches were very poorly attended, much more poorly attended, may I say, than the synagogues. Why? Yes, exactly, Joette. These guys who came by themselves, who were Jewish, they had a sense of community. I want to share something with you that we're going to flesh out a little bit more when we're all reading pieces together. A lady wrote a letter into one of the newspapers, in the Alta California newspaper in 1852, insisting that the observance of Sabbath, meaning Christian Sabbath, be legislated. And one of the things she did was, because none of the guys were going to church services, so this woman wrote this in, and she said that the Jews were responsible for the fact that the Christian people weren't showing up for church. Why? They were open. They were open on Sunday. So she decided to write in and say that the Mexicans, the Germans, and the Jews needed to have to close their businesses on Sunday. And a reply came from a man naming himself Justice, vindicated and praised the Jewish community instead. The law was not passed. So that is an indication of some anti-Jewish bias that we'll be talking about. It is an undercurrent in some anti-Semitism that grew in San Francisco. But even through those times, they felt strongly that their perseverance had led them to prosperity and security, and they were determined to build a community. So they rallied around the Jewish organizations, presented a united front, and got the younger guys to join the congregations. And so soon after, there was a dedication of Shearith Israel in 1854, and San Francisco had 2 synagogues. And now what I want to do before we close for today, do I have like 3 minutes? The women didn't come immediately in 1849. By the middle 1850s, there were more and more people coming, and people started to come in families because San Francisco started to develop. The Jewish community structure started to develop. More people came during those periods of time when the gold rush was still going on before it petered out, and they developed other kinds of businesses. When we get to gold rush country, we'll see some people were miners, some people were merchants, some people did, there were all sorts of people doing things. So women came soon after, but not at the beginning when it was really still the Wild West. Mention the lack of sanitation in what? Yes. Well, there was clearly a lack of sanitation. Interestingly enough, we're not talking about a lot of Jewish doctors. That comes later in our history. But there was, I think, not a lot of medical, there was not a lot of health plagues that affected the Jewish community, in that area. They didn't have anything like a COVID. Nothing. So this is what I want to show you. So I have 10 copies of this. So I'm going to pass it out in little snippets, and you can share with each other. And so here, and you have somebody behind you, so sorry to everybody at home, but it's an incredibly gorgeous synagogue built in the 1850s, still existent. If you take a look at it, you will see, and we'll discuss next time exactly what they built, but look at what a small, nascent Jewish community was able to do. Shereth Israel still exists.
Okay,
Yes.
so Susie mentioned that she'll send it out to everybody. She'll photograph it and send it out. So people in cyberspace will have access to it, and
Okay.
all of you.
Thank you.
synagogue that has like a balcony above the, and my cousin used to belong there, and I attended two bat and a bar mitzvah.
So do you want to say that so the people at home can hear you?
Yeah, well, my cousin used to belong to this synagogue when they lived in San Francisco, and both of her kids were b'nai mitzvah there, so we attended both the bat mitzvah of her daughter and the bar mitzvah of her son, and the synagogue is just incredibly beautiful.
I got the time frame wrong. It was built a little bit later. It was built at the beginning of the 1860s, not the end of the 1850s, but not such a big difference. And I think it's absolutely outstanding what they were able to do. So that's it for today. It's a Reform congregation. It's a Reform congregation. We'll get to that when we next week in terms of discussing, what happened with the religiosity of the people in the community and the synagogues. Wait 1 second. My father was in a little synagogue called B'nai Emunah that didn't exist at all in the 1800s. It was founded by German Holocaust survivors. So, yes, so a later synagogue. Gary, did you have something else you wanted to say? They changed locations, but it's in the same place that it was in from 1862 or whenever they started the building process. So that's it for today. I hope this has been okay, even though it's been kind of lecture-y. We have another week of that because we're going to finish San Francisco and go to Los Angeles next week. I'd like to, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Is your father's synagogue B'nai Emunah?
B'nai Emunah.
You won't believe this, the synagogue that I attended in St. Louis.
Was B'nai Emunah?
There you go. I'm glad I asked.
Thank you. Thank you for asking. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week. I look forward to seeing you again next week.
Oh, okay, good. Good, thank you. find out what the maiden name was, because her father had gone to the gold country when the gold rush started, and he realized that these people needed pails and shovels and all the clothing. So he
Started a business.
He started a business, and in their home on Citrus, they had the mother's original furniture, which was real small Victorian.
Yes.
And all of these treasures came from there. I'm going to call
Oh, please
Andrew.
find out that information. That would
yes.
be wonderful.
And I imagine that they were probably buried up there too.
Maybe.
This was so fascinating. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah.
I was so worried that when I had to lecture that,
Oh,
that
it was beautiful.
Thank you.
So I loved it. I cherished it.
Thank you.
Okay.
So nice to meet you.
Rabbi Alexander? Rabbi Alexander?
Wow. See? Oh, that's just amazing.
Well, and the other thing, you have to talk into the mic here. But that will kind of work itself out.
Right.
Now, how does it work if people in the room speak? Now,
They'll
your
be
dad-
heard.
Oh, they have an owl. There's an owl in the wind. I've never.
They'll be heard, people will speak, people at home will hear them.
Yeah, well, because
Because I leave, even in the Deber, I leave Minion.
Yeah, I heard
Good morning, I don't have a mic. Everybody at home hears everything.
Yeah, but you have to be standing right at the podium. Yes, yes.
No, Jim Lesterman is sitting Shiva now, and he talked about his brother yesterday, and people heard.
Friday morning, no class. Well, we'll talk about it. Okay, no, I'm.
Let's see how it goes. If they'll be live, I'll see them, and if they don't hear something, they'll tell me. And then we will adapt.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
No, I'm sure. I'm fine. I mean, I really am. I think it's great. Because we need to include everybody.
You know,